She did not die screaming. She did not die defiant. In a silent convent room, far from crowns and chandeliers, the woman who once ruled the heart of the most powerful king in Europe exhaled a single word: pardon. And with that breath, France closed its eyes, while history refused to forget. Paris, late spring. The air was still, heavy with the kind of silence that presses against stone walls. Inside a convent chamber dimly lit by a trembling candle, a frail woman lay dying. Her hands, once weighed down by jewels, rested empty upon her chest. Her breath came shallow now, uneven. The body that had once dazzled Versailles had been reduced to quiet surrender. She had lived surrounded by noise, music, laughter, whispers, envy. But death arrived in silence. Her name was Françoise Athénaïs, known to history as Madame de Montespan, the most powerful mistress France ever produced. A woman adored, feared, envied, condemned. A woman accused of sins so dark they still stain the page of history. And yet, in her final moment, she asked not for power, but forgiveness. That single word, pardon, hangs like smoke over her entire life. Before scandal, before witchcraft whispers, before kings and poisons and ruined reputations, there was a child. She was born in October 1640 in western France, among river valleys and ancient stone estates where nobility was measured not only in land, but in memory. Her family name carried weight. Her father, Duke of Mortemart, walked with inherited certainty. Her mother served Queen Anne of Austria herself. From birth, Athénaïs was never meant for obscurity. She was raised among tutors, priests, and expectations heavy enough to crush a weaker spirit. Her childhood unfolded in echoing halls, scented with wax and parchment. She learned her prayers before she learned freedom. Latin hymns settled into her memory. Faith shaped her posture long before ambition shaped her voice. And yet, even then, something stirred beneath obedience. When her parents traveled to Paris, she glimpsed another world, one of silk and murmured intrigue. But those visits were brief. At 18, she was sent away to a convent. The doors closed behind her. Childhood ended. For 5 years, the convent trained her body into discipline and sharpened her mind into observation. Bells ruled her days. Silence taught her patience. And behind her calm exterior, wit was quietly forming, refined, dangerous, precise. If you're drawn to stories where history hides its sharpest truths behind silence, this is where you should subscribe, because what grows in quiet places often reshapes empires. At 18, she returned to society, no longer a girl, but a presence. France itself was shifting. The young king, Louis XIV, was consolidating power after chaos. The court was becoming a battlefield disguised as a ballroom. Noble daughters were placed like chess pieces. Athénaïs was one of them. But unlike most, she learned to move herself. She entered court service not by accident, but by design. Her beauty was noticed. Her voice was remembered. Her wit, dangerously, was repeated. Yet her early life did not unfold as a fairy tale. A youthful engagement ended abruptly when her fiancé fled France after killing a man in a duel. Honor, in that era, was as fragile as glass. In a single moment, her future collapsed. She learned her first lesson. At court, lives change without warning. Soon after, she married Louis-Henri de Gondren, Marquis de Montespan. The marriage promised stability. Paris celebrated. She bore children. Outwardly, she played her role. But inside the marriage, cracks formed early. Her husband gambled recklessly, debts mounted. His pride grew unstable. While Athénaïs ascended socially, he declined privately. And slowly, inevitably, the rhythm of her life accelerated. She was admired, watched, talked about, and then the king noticed her. Louis XIV was already married, already adored, already powerful beyond imagination. But power does not shield a man from desire. At first, it was glances, lingering attention, proximity disguised as coincidence. Athénaïs did not rush. She waited. Because the most dangerous moves at court were never hurried. If you want to understand how a woman climbed higher than queens and fell harder than sinners, stay with this story. The next part takes us inside Versailles, where admiration turns into rivalry and friendship becomes betrayal. Versailles did not welcome the weak. It swallowed them. The palace glittered like a promise and rotted like a trap. Mirrors multiplied every smile. Chandeliers spilled light that revealed everything and forgave nothing. Here, beauty was currency, wit was armor, silence was survival. When Athénaïs de Montespan entered this world, she understood something most never did. At court, love was not affection, love was leverage. She arrived not as a conqueror, but as a presence, appointed maid of honor to Henrietta Anne of England, the king's sister-in-law. It was a position secured through family prestige, yes, but what she did with it was entirely her own making. She watched first. She listened. Versailles was a theater where every gesture mattered. A raised eyebrow could undo a reputation. A laugh, timed correctly, could elevate a nobody into influence. Athénaïs learned to read the room the way generals read battlefields. And soon, the room began to read her. Men leaned closer when she spoke. Women measured themselves against her reflection in the mirrors. Ministers noticed how conversations shifted when she entered, not louder, sharper. Her beauty was acknowledged, but it was her voice that lingered. A voice that could charm without begging, challenge without offending, mock without cruelty. That voice reached the king. Louis XIV was young, radiant, and already conscious of his divinity. He was the Sun King in formation, aware that all eyes revolved around him, yet restless beneath ceremony. He wanted admiration, but he needed stimulation. At that time, his heart belonged, at least officially, to Louise de la Vallière. Louise was gentle, devout, soft-spoken. She loved the king with sincerity and fear. She asked for nothing and expected less. And for a time, that was enough. Athénaïs entered her orbit as a friend. They dined together, laughed together, shared confidences. To an outsider, there was no rivalry, only companionship between two women navigating the same impossible space. But beneath the smiles, a quiet imbalance formed. Louise loved the king. Athénaïs understood him. She did not rush him. She did not demand affection. She allowed proximity to do its work. She allowed comparison to happen naturally. Where Louise lowered her gaze, Athénaïs met his. Where Louise apologized for existing, Athénaïs made existence irresistible. It wasn't seduction in the obvious sense. It was alignment. She challenged him in conversation, teased him lightly, disagreed without defiance. For a man surrounded by obedience, resistance, clever resistance, was intoxicating. If you're watching this series because you want to understand how power actually shifts in history, this is a moment worth subscribing for, because what happened next changed the balance of Versailles forever. By the winter of 1666, whispers had begun. Shared carriage rides, conversations that lasted too long, glances that lingered past propriety. The court noticed before Louise did, and when Louise realized it, it was already over. By spring 1667, Athénaïs de Montespan was no longer just admired, she was chosen. The king turned toward her not with hesitation, but with certainty, and when the Sun King turned, the court followed. Louise faded slowly, humiliated but silent. Eventually, she withdrew into a convent, carrying her heartbreak into prayer. Athénaïs remained. But triumph at Versailles always came with a price. To be the king's mistress was to stand in a place both exalted and exposed. She gained jewels, apartments, influence. Her words mattered, her preferences shaped fortunes. And yet, she was never safe, because power at court did not forgive visibility. Her marriage fractured under the weight of her ascent. The Marquis de Montespan reacted not with discretion, but spectacle. He dressed in mourning black, declaring his wife dead to him. He mocked the king publicly. It was unforgivable. The king had him arrested, exiled, removed. Athénaïs paid attention. She learned that love at court was tolerated only when it did not embarrass power. Children followed. One after another, she bore the king's offspring, hidden at first, protected in secrecy, then, astonishingly, legitimized, given royal names, elevated beyond the reach of ordinary scandal. It was unprecedented. She was no longer simply a mistress, she was a mother of princes. But this visibility sharpened envy into hatred. Priests frowned. Confessors hesitated. Courtiers whispered. How could a woman live in open sin and still kneel at the altar? How could she hold the king so completely? Rumors crept in where admiration once lived. Potions, charms, forbidden practices. At first they sounded absurd, the inventions of jealousy. But jealousy repeated often enough becomes belief, and belief becomes danger. Athénaïs, outwardly radiant, felt the shift. She laughed louder, entertained more brilliantly, refused to retreat. Pride stiffened her spine. She would not yield. Not yet. But Versailles had already begun sharpening its knives. Power changes the air around a person. When Athénaïs de Montespan walked through Versailles at the height of her favor, conversations adjusted themselves around her like curtains drawn by an unseen hand. Laughter arrived a second late. Compliments became cautious. Admiration began to feel measured. She felt it before she heard it. The shift was subtle at first, a confessor's hesitation, a priest's tightened mouth, a courtier who bowed lower than before but no longer met her eyes. Faith had always been part of her life, not the soft faith of retreat, but the structured faith of discipline. She attended Mass, she prayed, she knelt with intensity that surprised even those who disliked her. Yet now the very thing she clung to began to turn against her. One Easter, she approached the altar as she always had. The priest refused her. No quiet explanation, no private counsel, just a public denial that echoed across the chapel like a slap. Her life, he said, was a scandal to all of France. She stood, unmoving. In Versailles, humiliation mattered more than pain. She returned again and again, seeking absolution, seeking peace. Each time the answer was colder. The message was clear. You may have the king's love, but heaven is closed to you. If this story is gripping you the way it should, now is the moment to subscribe, because this is where admiration curdles into something far more dangerous. The court watched her struggle with fascination. Some felt satisfaction, others felt unease. A woman denied forgiveness was a woman exposed, and exposure invited speculation. It began with murmurs. How could she still hold the king? How could her beauty still command him as youth faded? How could rivals vanish so easily from his side? Wit no longer seemed explanation enough. Someone spoke the word first in a whisper. Then someone else repeated it. Charms. Then soon after, potions. Athenaeus heard the rumors like distant thunder. She dismissed them outwardly, laughed at their absurdity. But rumor does not require truth to grow. It only requires repetition. Paris, unlike Versailles, did not dress its darkness in silk. Beyond the palace walls, a different world thrived, one of fortune-tellers, midwives, apothecaries, and women who sold hope to the desperate. In alleys where superstition was currency, people paid to believe the impossible. Names surfaced, one in particular, a woman known for supplying powders to end pregnancies, brews to inflame love, poisons to hasten death. Her clients ranged from servants to nobles. And slowly, inevitably, Athenais's name drifted into the same breath. No accusation was made openly, no charge was brought, just association, and association was enough. The irony was cruel. The woman accused of flirting with darkness was deeply religious. The woman whispered about as a sorceress sought communion again and again. Each refusal carved deeper. Pride and faith collided inside her. She gave generously to the poor, endowed hospitals, supported orphan children, not quietly, because quiet generosity is easily forgotten, but not boastfully either. Some said it was penance, others said it was strategy, but generosity did not silence suspicion. Versailles had learned to enjoy the story, because stories with shadows last longer. At court, new women appeared, younger, softer, less complicated. The king's gaze did not leave Athenaïs, but it lingered elsewhere now. She felt it, and fear sharpens resolve. If she had once relied on brilliance alone, she now worked twice as hard to remain indispensable. She entertained relentlessly, held salons that dazzled, kept the king laughing, engaged, alive. But laughter cannot drown whispers, and whispers were becoming testimony. In Paris, authorities began listening to the wrong people, in the wrong way, for the wrong reasons. Interrogations blurred fear with imagination, confessions spilled out under pressure, and names were written down. Athenaïs's name appeared more than once. The king intervened. Documents disappeared. Witnesses were silenced. Files were sealed. The scandal that would become known as the affair of the poisons was contained, barely. Officially, she was untouched. Unofficially, she was stained. The protection that saved her also isolated her. Courtiers became careful, ministers distant, even friends spoke in lowered voices. Power still surrounded her. Trust did not. At night, she prayed harder. At court, she smiled brighter. And somewhere between prayer and performance, a quiet dread settled in her chest, not of punishment, but of replacement. Because rumors do not kill queens, they make room for new ones.
Versailles had always rewarded brilliance. It had crowned beauty, sharpened wit into power, and elevated spectacle into authority. For years, Athénaïs de Montespan had mastered that language perfectly. She sparkled where others faded. She dominated rooms that devoured lesser spirits. But history rarely repeats itself so neatly. Sometimes it changes tone, quietly. While Athénaïs fought whispers with laughter and scandal with splendor, another woman was rising, almost invisibly. She did not compete, she did not charm, she did not shine. And that was precisely why she was dangerous. Her name was Françoise d'Aubienne, known at court as Madame Scarron. She entered Versailles not through ambition, but necessity. Widowed young, poor, dependent. Her life had been shaped by endurance rather than triumph. When she was appointed governess to the king's children, the very children Athénaïs had borne but rarely raised, it seemed insignificant, a practical arrangement, a servant's role. Athénaïs barely noticed, at first. Madame Scarron dressed plainly, spoke softly, carried herself without ornament. Where Athénaïs commanded attention, Scarron dissolved into the background. But children noticed what courts often ignore. She was patient, present, steady. She became the rhythm of their days, the voice that read to them, the presence that did not vanish after ceremonies ended. To them, she was not a symbol of power, but of safety. And the king noticed that too. King Louis XIV watched his children flourish under her care, not just educated, but grounded, calm, secure. In her presence, the chaos of his private life seemed organized. Scarron did not advise him. She did not tease him. She did not challenge him. She simply listened. And for a king growing older, burdened by conscience, faith, and the weight of absolutism, listening was rare and precious. Athénaïs sensed the shift before it was spoken. The king stayed longer with the children. Conversations that once ended in laughter now ended in reflection. His gaze softened, not toward brilliance, but toward stability. The court began to recalibrate. Subtle at first. Courtiers lingered near Scarron longer. Priests spoke of her approvingly. Confessors used her name as an example of virtue. The contrast was devastating. Athénaïs, once untouchable, now seemed loud. Her wit, once admired, felt sharp. Her pride, once commanding, felt defiant. Her presence, once radiant, now reminded people of everything the court was trying to forget: sin, scandal, excess. Scarron embodied the opposite. She prayed quietly, she spoke carefully, she never competed, because she didn't have to. If you're still watching at this point, this is the moment to subscribe, because this rivalry was never fought openly, and its consequences reshaped the French monarchy itself. Athénaïs tried to hold her ground. She doubled down on charm, hosted extravagant gatherings, reminded the king of who she had been to him, of the years they shared, of the children they created. But nostalgia does not defeat conscience, and conscience had found a voice. Priests who once denied Athénaïs absolution now praised Scarron's devotion. Where Athénaïs was turned away from the altar, Scarron knelt in quiet acceptance. The king noticed everything, and guilt began to outweigh desire. By the time the affair of the poisons faded into silence, something else had changed. The king no longer defended Athénaïs with the same urgency. He protected her from ruin, but not from irrelevance. Her enemies sensed it. Her allies hesitated. Athénaïs was still present, but no longer central. The final blow was not dramatic. It never is. She was not banished, not publicly disgraced. Instead, she was slowly replaced. Scarron was elevated, granted titles, given respect. Her role expanded beyond governess. She became confidant, moral anchor, the woman who could reconcile the king's faith with his authority. Athenaeus watched it happen, and pride, the very thing that had lifted her, now kept her from retreating gracefully. She refused to fade quietly. She clashed, protested, mocked, asserted herself where humility would have softened the transition. And in doing so, she confirmed what the court had already decided. She belonged to the past. By 1691, the decision was made. Athenaeus left Versailles, not in disgrace, but in defeat. She received a vast pension, retained her wealth, kept her status. On paper, she lost nothing. In truth, she lost everything that mattered to her: power, influence, proximity to the king. She withdrew into a life of charity and religious devotion, pouring her fortune into hospitals, orphanages, and schools. Some said it was repentance. Others said it was necessity. Perhaps it was both. And while Athenaeus prayed behind convent walls, Madame Scarron, now known as Madame de Maintenon, stood quietly at the king's side, not as a mistress, but as his wife in all but name.
Exile does not always come with chains. Sometimes it arrives with silence. When Athénaïs de Montespan left Versailles, there was no public announcement, no dramatic farewell. The palace did not close its gates behind her. It simply stopped opening its doors. The court moved on with remarkable efficiency. New rituals replaced old ones. New voices filled the spaces where her laughter once echoed. The mirrors still reflected silk and gold, but her image no longer appeared among them. She was given everything that looked like mercy: a staggering pension, estates, servants, influence preserved on paper, but power once lost cannot be purchased back. For the first time since her youth, Athénaïs lived without an audience. She withdrew into a quieter world, one of chapels, hospitals, and charitable foundations. Her days were no longer measured by ceremonies, but by bells calling the faithful to prayer. She gave generously: hospitals for the elderly, shelters for abandoned children, schools for girls who would never know Versailles. Her fortune flowed outward as if she were trying to empty herself of the life she had lived. Some whispered that she was buying forgiveness. Others believed she was finally living the faith she had always professed. The truth sat somewhere in between. Because Athénaïs had never stopped believing in God, she had only failed to live in a way that made belief comfortable. Now, stripped of spectacle, she knelt as she once had in the convent of her youth, older, heavier with memory, sharper with regret. She prayed constantly, not the performative prayers of court, but the repetitive, almost desperate kind. Prayers for her soul, for her children, for reconciliation, and for absolution that had been denied to her for decades. If this chapter of her life feels haunting, this is a moment worth subscribing, because history rarely shows us what happens after the crown slips. Her body began to fail her. Breath shortened, strength ebbed, illness crept in slowly, without drama, without symbolism. The body that had carried pride so easily now resisted even rest. Physicians came and went. Remedies offered comfort, not cure. She spent long hours in reflection. Her husband, long estranged, returned to her thoughts often. She had reached out to him years earlier, seeking reconciliation. He had refused then,
pride matching pride. And yet, in one final irony, he later named her executor of his estate. Love, it seemed, had survived resentment, but only after it was too late to heal. Her thoughts turned often to the king. Louis XIV had been the axis of her life, the source of her rise, the reason for her fall, the father of her children, the man who had loved her and then replaced her. She never spoke ill of him, not once. Whether out of lingering affection or final humility, she carried his memory quietly. Their relationship had ended not with hatred, but with exhaustion. Time, not betrayal, had defeated her. Her children visited when they could. They were grown now, legitimized, established, shaped by another woman's care. Their bond with her was real, but strained by distance and history. They loved her deeply, and she knew she had not always been present. That knowledge hurt more than any rumor ever had. As illness worsened, priests returned to her bedside. Some remained stern, others softened. Death has a way of stripping judgment down to compassion. She confessed repeatedly, asked forgiveness repeatedly, not just for scandal, but for pride, for ambition, for refusing to step aside when grace demanded it. In her final days, her room smelled of wax and incense. Candles burned low. The walls were plain. There were no mirrors. Perhaps that was intentional. Breathing became labor. Words grew scarce. And then, clarity. Those who attended her later said her final moments were not dramatic, no visions, no proclamations, just awareness. She understood that history would not absolve her easily, that stories would outlive her intentions, that her name would always carry shadows. And so she did the only thing left to her. She asked. Her final word, spoken barely above a whisper, was not a defense. It was not regret. It was not justification. It was pardon, a word that carried her entire life inside it.
History does not deliver verdicts. It collects echoes. When Athenais de Montespan died, Versailles did not pause. The court adjusted itself with the same elegance it always had. Chairs were rearranged. Voices found new centers of gravity. The palace, indifferent as marble, continued to reflect faces that were no longer hers. There was no public mourning, no official remembrance. The woman once called the true Queen of France was laid to rest quietly, far from the mirrors where her image had multiplied for years. Bells tolled, not for power, but for passage. And yet, silence did not erase her, because stories had already escaped containment. Courtiers wrote memoirs, priests recorded judgments, enemies sharpened their versions, admirers softened theirs. Each account preserved a fragment, never the whole. Some remembered her brilliance, the wit that held ministers silent, the confidence that matched a king's authority, the intelligence that turned conversation into influence. Others remembered scandal, the affair of the poisons, the whispers of sorcery, the accusations never proven, yet never forgotten. And still others remembered generosity, hospitals funded, orphans sheltered, girls educated who would otherwise have vanished unnamed into poverty. History could not decide which image to keep, so it kept them all. That is the cruelty and honesty of memory. Athenais lived at the intersection of contradictions. She embodied the splendor of Louis XIV's reign and its moral fracture. She was both symbol and symptom of Versailles, where magnificence thrived alongside decay, where faith coexisted with indulgence, where power demanded spectacle and punished vulnerability. She rose higher than women were meant to rise, and she paid for it in full. The accusations against her, of black masses, poisons, unspeakable rites remain unproven. Extracted through fear, repetition, and superstition, they reveal more about the age that believed them than the woman they targeted. In a world terrified of female influence, ambition needed a darker explanation. Wit became witchcraft, confidence became corruption, longevity became unnatural. Yet history rarely pauses to ask, why was she so dangerous to imagine as innocent? Perhaps because accepting her innocence would require acknowledging something more unsettling, that a woman, armed only with intelligence, presence, and will, could shape an empire without supernatural aid. That idea was harder to tolerate than any accusation. And yet, Athenais never defended herself. She left no confession, no refutation, no final testimony, only that word, pardon. It is tempting to read it as guilt, equally tempting to read it as exhaustion or humility. But perhaps it was none of those. Perhaps it was simply human. She had lived loudly, loved fiercely, sinned publicly, given generously, prayed relentlessly, and at the end, she asked for what all people ask for when power, beauty, and reputation finally fall away: mercy. That request does not erase her contradictions, it completes them. Today, when historians walk through the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, they do not see her portrait hanging on the walls, but her presence lingers there all the same, in the spaces between reflections, in the memory of how power once moved through conversation rather than decree. She reminds us that influence does not always wear a crown, that scandal often survives truth, and that women who reshape history are rarely allowed peaceful endings. Was she a sinner? Yes, by the standards of her age. Was she a victim? Undeniably, of rumor, envy, and a system that tolerated her power only while it served male authority. Was she a benefactor? Absolutely, to those who never mattered enough for court gossip to care. She was all of these things, and that is why her story endures. If this journey through shadowed history has stayed with you, this is the moment to subscribe, because stories like hers are not meant to comfort us, they are meant to complicate us. Athenais de Montespan does not ask us to absolve her, she asks us to remember her honestly, not as a monster, not as a saint, but a woman who dared to exist fully in a world that demanded silence, and history, reluctantly, has granted her that. The final bell fades, the mirrors empty, but the question she leaves behind remains. How many women were erased not because they failed, but because they succeeded? That is the legacy she left us to wrestle with.